Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's episode, we're joined by sports enterprise writer Alex Coffey. Alex is one of my favorite sports writers. She spent a little less than 2 years at The Athletic covering the Seattle Storm of the WNBA and the Oakland A's in Major League Baseball. Now she's going it on her own as a freelancer, but this is high-level freelancing. Her recent work has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, and Fox Sports. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.
So the first thing that we always ask everyone, share the story of your journalism path.
Yeah, my path was not a straight line. I was introduced to sports writing through my dad, who was a sports writer himself for the New York Daily News. He would bring me to events. I went to the Olympics. I went to two different Olympics in 1994, and in 2006, he would bring me to the US Open. He'd bring me to baseball games, and I don't know how this was allowed, but he would just bring me into the press box. Kind of seems like that is a thing of the past now.
Yep.
And, so I was always around writers. I was always around journalism. But I think another influence on me was he just raised me on really good writing. I read like books of Red Smith's work, and Frank DeFord was one of my favorite writers. Like these old school guys. Like I don't know. I came up reading that kind of stuff. So I think that had an impact on me too. But originally I didn't really have, I don't know. It hadn't really clicked in my head. I didn't really see it as a career for myself. And part of that was just seeing the brutal, like layoffs and like the ugly side of the industry. And I think that kind of spooked me as I was graduating college. But after college, I worked in PR for a couple of years for the Seattle Mariners and the Baseball Hall of Fame. And when I was out in Seattle, I just kind of had an epiphany moment and realized that I didn't want to do PR anymore, and that I was leaving my job to become a freelancer and hope that it all works out, which my parents were less than thrilled about. And yeah, so I basically just kind of bet on myself, took a job with The Athletic, a freelance job covering the WNBA. And then it was just kind of in the right place at the right time when a full-time job opened up to cover the A's. So a lot of luck involved too, but that's kind of my path in the Cliff Notes version of my path.
Sure, that's the Cliff Notes. Let's get a little more specific. You come from a journalism family all the way around, not just your father, but your mother too, and your brother. Can you tell us can you tell us a little bit more background on each of them?
Yeah, so my mom used to work for Scholastic in publishing, and before that, she worked for a newspaper outside of Baltimore. So she worked for a newspaper in Maryland. She also did a little bit of photojournalism, which complemented her background. She studied international relations in college, so she would go and do things like take photos of, like go to Tibet and take photos of monks being shot at by Chinese police officers, really easing her way into the photojournalism sphere, and then smuggled it back and sold it to, I think it was Life magazine. Yeah, so she did that kind of stuff. And then my brother he was a sportscaster for a news station down in Texas, and he recently got a promotion. Now he's an anchor at a TV station in Pennsylvania. So yeah, we're all kind of, and then my sister's a soccer player at Penn State. So we all have our own corner of this world. Me and my dad kind of occupy more of a similar corner of it, but yeah, definitely have journalism roots there.
All right. So your family, I would say, fully immersed in the journalistic and sports worlds. Do you have a favorite time and person in sports history, or a favorite journalist in history that you'd like to share with us?
I don't know about time, but I would say, I guess time, I would say the 70s, just because I just love how like managers would go berserk. And this isn't like a 70s exclusive thing, but when I think about the 70s, I think about like Sparky Anderson, like all these, I don't know. I kind of think of like those old school managers who would, throw a temper tantrum and like throw dirt in people's, like I love that. Like I love the art of that and how you can use how it's kind of this like way of motivating your players even though you're making a fool of yourself. And that's something that we don't really have anymore.
Yep.
So I would say 70s and some great uniforms back then too. So that would be my pick for time, like 70s baseball. And then I wrote a story a while back about, I don't know if we ever talked about it, but about Clyde Sukeforth, who is a former player who became a scout. And he worked for the Dodgers organization and was the guy that scouted both Jackie Robinson and Roberto Clemente. He had moved to the Dodgers or the Pirates when he scouted Clemente. So he did both of those for Branch Rickey. And he is my favorite just because he grew up in a really small town in Maine, you know, not a diverse place at all, the area that he grew up in. But he just had this, you know, he was just very ahead of his time, very progressive, and, you know, just treated both of those guys with respect. And like he had he was a big key in both of those guys making it to the big leagues, and, you know, didn't do it for clout. So he's probably my favorite.
And a favorite sports writer?
I don't think I could pick one. If I had to pick like three, it'd probably be S.L. Price, Frank DeFord, and who did I mention earlier? I'm drawing a blank now. Roger Angel. But I mean, contemporary people, I think my favorite is actually Jeff Passan. He's a good friend of mine. You know, he's a great guy, obviously, and I give him like a ton of credit for being able to report the way he does, and he can kind of do everything. He's on TV, he can break news, but his writing is spectacular, and he's got a real gift for writing feature stories, even if that is not his his full-time job, which kind of pisses me off. So
yep, I fully understand what you're saying there. I had one other thing before we dive into some of your work. When I was in my early 20s, I was very into baseball history, very into sports history, very into history in general. And when I dealt with people, I think they were somewhat taken aback by a young person's interest in history. And I'm curious if you had any encounters like that in your sports writing travels.
Yeah, no, I definitely have. Just working at the Hall of Fame, and, you know, my job was to be immersed in history. And even though it was my job, I definitely got the sense that people were surprised that someone who was, how old was I when I was working there? Like 25 or so, was as steeped into it as she was. But I mean, I've always been interested in history. It's something that, you know, I studied in college, and it's always been something that I've been passionate about. And the game's history is so rich, you know, it's easy to kind of dive into. So yeah, I definitely get that kind of reaction of like, how old are you? Were you alive when that happened? Like, well, you know,
yep,
all that sort of stuff. But I take pride in it.
Nice. Okay, so you're writing, you don't look for what I would call run-of-the-mill stories, and I get the feeling that you're not necessarily that into transactional journalism. This guy's injured. This guy's on the injured list. This guy's called up. What characterizes your writing?
I would say, I think empathy and, like, you know, just trying to understand how certain things feel. That's kind of at I mean, it sounds like an obvious way to put it, but that's what I'm always trying to kind of get to the bottom of, is even if I am reporting something out that's transactional. Like I remember there was I don't know, like there was a trade a while back, and it was like the first trade that the A's and the Giants had made in a really long time. Like they don't make a lot of trades. And you know, I had the option of reporting it straight and just saying like, wow, this is like a historical anomaly. This never happens. And just writing about the player they acquired, who was Birch Smith, and they just acquired him for cash considerations. But then I ended up doing some digging and realized that the last time a player had been traded, I think it was Darren Lewis. Yeah. And then I like went down this rabbit hole and realized that Darren Lewis was named, or Darren Baker, Dusty Baker's son, was named for Darren Lewis. And it ended up being this whole, and apparently like Dusty Baker was also in one of these trades, these like Bay Area I don't remember if it was A's to Giants or Giants to A's, but anyway, it was like just this weird historical link that connected them. So I ended up writing this like story about that and like how they were connected by these rare rare trades, and why Dusty named his kid after Darren, and like it kind of became more of a story about their relationship. But yeah, I don't know, I guess I'm always trying to kind of like get to the bottom of like how people process things, and how, like, I don't know, baseball is full of all this movement, like transactions and people being placed on the IL, and like all like a million things happening at once. But I think that there's like if you kind of take a microscope and pause everything and like really think about, you know, what it's like to, I don't know, be traded to X team when you've been with Y team for X amount of time, or like I don't know, I'm always looking at things through that lens. I think it's definitely, I would characterize it as having more of a human interest like tilt to it.
I wrote empathy, deep sense of history, well reported, clever idea. And as a writer, when I read your work, my response at the end of it is usually, how the heck did she come up with that? All right. Anyway, yeah. And with that in mind, you know what? I'm going to flip the order a little bit here. I want to go to the first story that I can remember reading of yours, which was in The Athletic a couple of years ago. It began with this lead. I think great bookstores reflect the population of the city they're in. And the books that player, whose name is Corey Guerin, likes aren't basic fare. The book that changed his life was The Alchemist, about a boy who follows a prophetic dream to Egypt in search of treasure. Then you're in the library with this baseball player, trading favorite last lines with him, and you agree. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, which is the last line of The Great Gatsby. And he's standing there with you, and he makes a joke. Who knows, maybe F. Scott Fitzgerald can help you get out of a jam in Yankee Stadium. And the next thing you know, you're talking about Civil War reconstruction. All this somehow for a sports story. And in the middle of the conversation, he doesn't get traded. He gets claimed by the New York Yankees. And he has to leave the store. And then he goes off to begin his new life in Yankee Stadium, where he was just talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald is going to help him get out of a jam. So this in sum, you were interviewing a baseball player about the books he reads in a bookstore, and he basically got traded in the middle of the interview. Explain the story, how it came about to how it concluded.
Yeah, so it came about when I was working for the Mariners. I got to know Corey then, and you know, you pick up things that guys say, and you have like, you know, kind of more casual conversations with them. And because I was working with I speak Spanish proficiently, so I was working with a lot of the Latin players, so I would be like in and out of the clubhouse fairly often. So I got to know him, I think in spring training, the first like the year, but I got to know him the first like spring training that I worked for them, or the only spring training I worked for them. And you know, I just remember him mentioning how much he liked books. And I remember seeing him reading in the clubhouse and just thinking to myself, like, that's interesting. Like, you know, that's not something that you see every day.
Yep.
And I was writing stories for the Mariners website at the time. And I asked him if he'd be open to going to a bookstore together. And he said he was. Then I got my job with The Athletic. But before I left, I asked him if he would still be open to it. And he said he was. So I kind of just like kept it in the back of my mind. I was kind of preoccupied with WNBA stuff at first. But yeah, we set something up, and, you know, it was just one of those stories where it just kind of like fell into place perfectly between him saying the thing about Yankee Stadium and him getting the call. And, you know, at first I was kind of like, what's going on? Like, what? You know, at that point we had been in this bookstore for 2 hours, and I thought I was just going to kind of report it. Like the reporting aspect of that one is kind of unique, just because it starts as like, you think you're just reporting, I don't know, like this thing that happened in the past, but then, I don't know, you're kind of like peeling the curtain back for the reader to like see what you're seeing, you know, like kind of, you're almost like cluing them into the reporting process, and it takes this like kind of unexpected turn, and the reader is like seeing it in real time. I guess you're not really like shifting, you know, tenses, or like, you know, it's not like past and present, like you're not like shifting time, but was definitely a different,
It's such a cool
unexpected turn.
story.
Yeah.
Like I'm if this podcast has largely been about all different types of things, and this is when I was like, oh, I should do a sports one. Now that I'm 50 episodes in and I haven't done, I've done one sports episode, and I work in sports, but what you write goes so far like beyond sports that it's really cool the way that everything kind of comes together. Okay, so that's one example of the kind of piece that you've done, visiting a bookstore with a Major League Baseball player talking The Alchemist, Civil War Reconstruction, and The Great Gatsby. All right, so let's take it to a much more serious part. You've said that your father is a hard act to follow sometimes. You just followed his act. A recent piece about former Major League Baseball player and New York City police officer Stan Jefferson for Fox Sports. It's a sad story in a lot of ways. He was at ground zero for days after 9/11, and he struggled. It's an understatement to say he struggled to deal with it. It's basically created something for him that goes beyond social anxiety. The intrigue of this is in 2007, your dad wrote an article about Stan Jefferson and what he was dealing with in the first 5 to 6 years after 9/11. Now you're revisiting the story. I'm curious what that experience was like.
Yeah, at first, because my dad had written a story like about Stan, I was not really keen on following it up, just because I don't love, like I said, he's a tough act to follow, and I knew I wasn't going to write something as good as he wrote it. So I was just like, why would I put myself in a position where I'm going to be compared to you? But I read his story and it was great, but he kind of took more of an angle of, here's this homegrown kid from New York. He caught Stan at a part of his life where he had kind of hit rock bottom. So in that respects, the two stories were different. Not to say that Stan isn't struggling today. He's definitely still struggling, but his struggles are different. I felt like that was an important difference between the two. And, obviously with the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I felt like if I kind of centered it around 9/11 and like the ripple effects of that day, and, just focusing on how that day affected one person, this one specific person, then I could probably differentiate it enough. So that was kind of how that came to be. But yeah, it was definitely a difficult story for me to report, just because it's crazy. I mean, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it's crazy to think about if one person that was there and part of the cleanup effort was impacted in that way, in such a profound way, where their entire life changed and their brain changed, and they can't interact with people as easily as they once did. And it's just mind-blowing to think of how many other people are out there that are still impacted by this. And I never really thought about it in those terms. I think I'd kind of thought about it as this one big thing that happened that was horrible, and this act of terrorism, and but when you kind of take a closer look, it's a lot
to
process.
Certainly. And it was certainly very well done. That was for foxsports.com. I want to run down a few other examples of pieces you've done. I'm just going to read a list here and we'll talk about a couple of them. You did a lengthy piece on the lack of diversity and leadership in Major League Baseball. You wrote a profile of the A's owner who doesn't talk to anybody. You talked to 20 people, but not the owner himself. You did an obituary on a 35-year hot dog vendor. You profiled the police officer that put Rickey Henderson, who's one of the all-time great baseball players, if you're unfamiliar with him, on the path to success. You wrote a current player who is taking a class in public health at Berkeley in the middle of the pandemic and wasn't telling anybody who he was. And then in your recent U.S. Open coverage, you do tennis too now. You wrote a little green book of advice that one of the players had, and he went on to score a major upset. So a few things here. One, with the Major League Baseball diversity piece, that was an intense piece. Has anything come of that in terms of follow-up?
Yeah, so the reason that piece came on my radar was because I was tooling around MLB's website one day and I came across their C-suite, which is like their executive level like people in their organization, and it was all white men. So I think right after that story published, they updated that page to include, I want to say 2 people of color, maybe 3. I don't know off the top of my head. It's a guess. That would be a guess, but they definitely hired people after that story and updated that page, or like who they consider part of their executive suite, so to speak. So I think, I mean, it's hard to, you know, with those kinds of things, it's hard to point to an exact cause and effect kind of thing, but I think it probably had some, you know, had some effect.
Well, it's an interesting experience writing a piece in which you have someone saying that the commissioner, the person in charge of Major League Baseball, does not have diversity on his radar. Certainly.
Yeah.
All right. So then the A's owner story. This is a good kind of educational thing for, I think, anyone that's trying to do a big feature on a reclusive kind of subject where you have to work around a lot of things. What was the experience like of trying to find people who would talk about this guy who's basically the heir to the Gap fortune, right? And he's worth billions of dollars, and he won't talk to anybody. What was that like?
Tough. It was tough. Like a long process. I reported that out for months. But yeah, it was basically just talking to as many people as I could. I remember going through the media guides and just like running through the names of the people that were on this what's the word, like in the ownership group, and like weren't in the ownership group anymore, to see if there were like people that, you know, they would have less at stake, you know, if they talked to me now. Like, you know, like I obviously reached out to people in the organization who are still in the organization, but usually people are more inclined to talk if they're not still working there. So I remember like combing through media guides, and like one of them ended up working out, like a former guy, and his name is Guy Saperstein, but he was in the ownership group. But yeah.
So what's the key there? Like, what's the key to getting a piece like that done?
Yeah, patience, and you just really have to be dogged about reaching out to as many people as you can possibly think of, and being really creative with who you reach out to, you know, like it doesn't always have to be something as obvious as an ownership group, you know. Sometimes it can be like, I didn't do this in my story, but like a thought that I had was, where's his suite, you know, in the ballpark, and like who are the workers that are in and out of there, you know, like who are the like designated, I don't know, you know what I mean, like who's like the
suite attendants,
like
yeah,
like the suite attendants, like that's, again, he doesn't sit in a suite as far as I can tell. He sits behind home plate, so like that didn't end up factoring in. But that's like an example of like, I think the way that you kind of have to think with these kinds of stories. You really have to, at least I try to think outside of the box, and like just try to think of like, who is this person interacting with on a day-to-day basis, you know. And maybe it's not as obvious as like their boss, or like he doesn't have a boss, but like, you know what I mean, like they're the people that work for him, or like,
sure,
you know. So just trying to be creative.
Who do you imagine that you're writing for when you write pieces like that?
In that situation, definitely the fan base, because the fan base is like, I mean, we would hear about it all the time, like how angry people were that he made X decision or Y decision. And not only was he making these decisions, but he wasn't talking about them publicly, or like explaining why. I think a big part of this is just the lack of communication, and like lack of clarity. Like no one knows why certain decisions are being made. So then they assume that they're being made because he's cheap, or because he's, you know, like, yeah, basically just because he's cheap. So there's a lot of assuming going on, a lot of assumptions being made, because he's not filling that void with like rhetoric.
Yep.
So that was who I was writing that one for.
You covered the A's for a year. You covered Major League Baseball for a year. Somewhere like New York, you go in the press box, the ratio of men to women covering the game, it's huge. It's a complete total. There are very few women and lots of men covering the Mets for the Yankees. In Oakland, it's a little different. San Francisco Chronicle reporter was a woman for a long time. San
Yeah.
Jose Mercury News reporter is a woman. MLB.com had a female reporter. I know AP's had female reporters covering the A's, and you're there. What was the experience like for you being a female sports writer specific to being in that city?
It was, I mean, it was interesting because it was kind of like the same thing when I was covering the WNBA too, like a lot of female reporters on that beat. I don't know, it felt comfortable for me. I felt like, you definitely encounter situations where people, you don't get the sense that they're taking you as seriously as they might otherwise take you. But it was, I don't know, I guess I felt like in that environment, it was a little bit, it might not have been as bad as it otherwise would be in a different market, just because there were female reporters that were on that beat, like by the time I got there. So
how do you get people to open up to you as well as you do? Because you clearly seem to have a knack and a gift for that. And whether that's Stan Jefferson or Corey Guerin or people talking about the owner, John Fisher, or Matt Olson or Matt Chapman on the A's, some of their star players, or the WNBA athletes that you've covered, or the US Open people, or Kim Ng, who's baseball's first female GM, when you happen to catch her in a seat at the US Open. I noticed that seems to be a common thing, that people open up to you very well.
I think a lot of it has to do with like preparation and just showing that you're interested in more than just like their stat line or their credentials, or like I honestly think it has less to do with me and more to do with the fact that, like, I guess the type of story that I'm reporting and making that clear to them. Like with Matt Olson, I was writing a story about a dear friend of his from home who is autistic, and they talk regularly, and I just wanted to write a story about their relationship, and the story really hadn't been written. I just heard about it from his brother. So like, I don't know, I think it's finding topics that these people that like mean a lot to these different people, and then just making it clear to them that you're really there to write that story and write it well and write it and do it in an accurate way. I think that that's kind of the key. I don't know if that makes
Sure.
sense or not, but another example, like I think probably the best example of this is I wrote a story about Sandy Koufax and Dave Stewart a little while ago, about how Sandy Koufax mentored Dave Stewart early in his career, and he taught him the stare, which I think is funny because I don't really think of Sandy when I think of like a menacing stare. I think of Dave, but Sandy was intimidating in his own right. So, but Sandy ended up talking for that story, and I think the moral of that lesson was, here's a guy that like never really talks to anyone, but if you get him on the right topic, like he doesn't want to talk about his career, he's asked about that a million times. He doesn't want to talk about Yom Kippur, like he's asked about that a lot. Like, if you catch him on a subject that he's not asked about a ton, and it also like, and this is a person that means a lot to him, I think that is, that can be the difference maker sometimes. So I think a lot of times it's like the topic of the story more than anything else.
One other before we ask our final question here.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a first person story about, you mentioned earlier that your sister is a soccer player at Penn State University. She was also drafted to play professiontional soccer. And you wrote about the experience of what that was like. First person stories are always really interesting to me. So I'm curious what that piece was like for you.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I don't really write in first person that often. But I felt like that was the only way that I could really do that. Because I had seen her journey kind of firsthand, but it was really important to me in writing it that I was honest about our relationship and how it wasn't always like us supporting each other. Like we're in that place now, but it took us a while to get there. And I think it's really natural, like they say sibling rivalries and stuff like that. But I just thought it was like, it's like a natural emotion for two sisters to have. And I felt like people might be able to relate to that, So I wanted to tell it in a way that was vulnerable. That's what I always want the people that I talk to. I always want to write stories that are vulnerable, that, that's what I'm always hoping to achieve when I write something. So I figured, like, why not expect the same thing out of myself, right?
Sure, exactly.
So that was kind of my approach to that one. But yeah, it was something that I did on a whim. I was watching on draft night, and I was more impacted by it than I thought I would, on an emotional level. And when I'm feeling a lot of, it sounds stupid, but when I'm feeling a lot of emotions, like, I often just write. And like, I wrote when my grandpa, who I was very close to, passed away. Like, and this was before I got into journalism. It's just what I've always done to kind of process what's going on around me. And so I just started writing about her journey. And then halfway through, I texted the soccer editors and was like, do you guys want this? Like, I'm writing this story about my sister. You know, like, I'm almost done. I have like 600 words left. At that point, like, I started writing it. I did not have the intention of it like ever seeing the light of day, but it did. So
and it was pretty cool. It was great. All right. So a lot of other topics we could certainly touch on here, but I want to bring this to a close. We always ask our guests at the end of the interview to pick a journalism organization that they would like to salute for their good work. Go ahead.
I would say Mark Hurrig. Mark Hurrig, he's just been, I ran it. I met him through The Athletic, but I'm still in touch with him, and he's just such a great writer. I love his voice, but he's also, he's just been such a mentor for me and a sounding board for different questions. And a lot of these questions are kind of nuanced. They're like situational, like, is X fair if I give this person X time to respond, or like, how should I frame Y, or, and he's great at answering that kind of stuff. And I have a lot of admiration for the way that he, a lot of people respect him. And I think it's because he goes about his job in a really empathetic way. Like, I remember one time we were talking about sources, and I was complaining that I didn't have enough sources in the A's organization. And he was like, why are you thinking of them as sources? Like, why, like, I hate that word. Why are we talking about them that way? And he kind of helped me rethink the way, like, and we shouldn't be, I mean, these are all people, right? Like, we shouldn't be looking at them any differently. We should just be looking at them as people. And, reframing it that way in my head really helped. So that's just like one little example, but Mark is someone that comes to mind for that.
That's a good call. Mark Curry, a editor, I believe he's basically like a story coach at The Athletic.
Yeah, he's I don't know exactly what his I think it might be like talent development or something. I'm not sure exactly what his title is, but
yeah, he's excellent. All right, Alex Coffey, thank you for taking the time to join us. Best of luck.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I have some follow-up with Alex, but first I want to tell you about a podcast that I've checked out recently. All over the world, democracy is getting turned upside down. Populism, autocratic rule, and disinformation are short-circuiting deliberation and consensus. The process is broken. The consequences are dire. So what can you do about it? Join Will Hitchcock and Siva Vaidyanathan on Democracy in Danger. Each week they interview brilliant guests who are helping save the government by the people, one episode at a time. Find Democracy in Danger wherever you get your podcasts, or visit dindanger.org. After we got done with the interview, I realized I had been a little rude. I picked out all the stories that I asked Alex about, but I never gave her the chance to share her favorite story. So I asked a follow-up.
I think my favorite one ever was one that I wrote for, I wrote it for The Athletic, and it was about a bullpen coach who was the descendant of a former Negro Leagues player. And it was basically just a story about how the record keeping in the Negro Leagues isn't always, it's spotty, even though they've, like, with the rollout and Baseball Reference and all that stuff, it's better than it was. But his grandfather, there were no records or anything of his career. It was all word of mouth. So it basically just became this story about, like, him carrying his grandfather's story and trying to tell it to anyone he can, because there isn't any sort of tangible record of his grandfather's career. And I think a lot of like Negro Leagues descendants deal with that because, it's like I said, the record keeping is spotty. So that one kind of sticks out in my mind, but they're all like my children.
Seriously, read Alex's work. It's awesome. And speaking from experience, reading her work will motivate you to dig deeper and write more. By the way, we're looking for feedback. If you listen to the show regularly, please let me know what you think and how we can improve. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter @JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.